bound by honor. When her father's debts threatened to ruin her family, Lady Isolde of Ashenmere had only one option: seek the aid of Sir Aldrich Blackwell, a knight feared for his merciless heart. He smirked as she stepped into his chamber. "You ask for my help, my lady," he murmured. "Tell me, do you truly understand what it will cost you?" Chapter 1. The Shadow of Ashenmere. The chill of the approaching autumn seeped into the stones of Ashenmere, a castle that had once stood proud and defiant against the rolling hills of Northumbria. Now, it felt more like a mausoleum, each echoing corridor whispering of a glorious past that was rapidly fading. Lady Isolde of Ashenmere, a woman whose beauty was only surpassed by her quiet strength, felt the cold acutely, not just in her bones, but in the marrow of her soul. Her reflection in the aged, silvered mirror of her chamber showed a woman of 25, her face framed by dark, unbound hair that cascaded down her back like a raven's wing. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a depth of sorrow that belied her years. The fine lines etched around those eyes spoke of sleepless nights, of poring over ledgers filled with figures that spelled doom. Her father, Lord Edmund, a man once revered for his wisdom and fairness, had succumbed to a weakness for games of chance, a weakness that had steadily eroded the family's fortune. Now, he lay abed, ravaged by a sickness that mirrored the decay of their estate, his breathing shallow, his spirit broken. Isolde clutched the heavy woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, the rough fabric a small comfort against the encroaching despair. The scent of wood smoke, usually a welcoming aroma, now carried a bitter tang, a reminder of the dwindling stores of firewood, of the approaching winter that threatened to be as harsh as their financial straits. She had tried everything. She had pleaded with the neighboring lords, men who had once feasted at her father's table, men who had sworn oaths of fealty. But their smiles were thin, their offers of help even thinner. The debts were too great, the risk too high. Ashenmere, once a beacon of hope, was now a crumbling edifice, a symbol of a fallen house. A single, desperate hope remained, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and awe: Sir Aldrich Blackwell. The Black Knight of Ravenswood, they called him. A man of ruthless efficiency, of unwavering loyalty to the crown, and of a darkness that was said to rival the deepest night. He was a lender of last resort, a man who dealt in favors as much as in gold. And Isolde knew, with a chilling certainty, that the favor he would demand would be a heavy one indeed. She had sent a messenger, a young, nervous stable boy named Thomas, with a sealed letter bearing the Ashenmere crest, a silver falcon against a field of gray. The falcon, once a symbol of their soaring ambition, now seemed to droop, its wings heavy with the weight of their plight. The waiting was the hardest part. Each creak of the castle timbers, each rustle of the wind through the battlements, sent a shiver of anticipation and dread through her. She spent the hours in the small chapel, the only place in the castle that still felt truly warm, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The scent of incense, a faint, lingering reminder of happier times, clung to the air. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Not for salvation, not for a miracle, but for strength. Strength to face whatever lay ahead, strength to bear the burden of her family's shame, strength to make a deal with darkness itself. The chapel's stained glass window, depicting St. George slaying the dragon, offered a small measure of solace. Isolde had always found comfort in the stories of courage and sacrifice, of good triumphing over evil. But now, the dragon seemed to loom larger, its shadow stretching across her heart. She wondered if she, like St. George, could find the courage to face her own dragon, even if it meant sacrificing a part of herself. The afternoon light began to fade, painting the chapel in hues of purple and gray. The silence was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy and purposeful. Isolde's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She rose, her knees stiff, her hands still clasped. The heavy oak door creaked open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the fading light. It was not Aldrich Blackwell. It was his steward, a man named Master Gareth, a thin, wiry individual with a face as sharp as a hawk's beak and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He bowed, his movements precise and economical. "My Lady Isolde," he said, his voice a dry rustle, "Sir Aldrich bids you attend him at Ravenswood. He awaits you at dusk." Isolde nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "I will be ready," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. As Master Gareth departed, Isolde felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She gripped the edge of the altar, her knuckles white. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She was going to Ravenswood, to the lair of the Black Knight, to bargain for her family's future. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that the price would be more than she could ever imagine. The falcon on her family crest seemed to weep silver tears in the fading light, reflecting her own unspoken fear. Chapter 2. A Knight's Cruel Bargain. The journey to Ravenswood was a blur of gray skies and windswept fields. Isolde rode beside Master Gareth, her silence a shield against the churning emotions within her. She had chosen her oldest, most serviceable gown, a dark green wool that offered warmth but little adornment. Her only jewelry was a simple silver chain bearing a small, intricately carved falcon, a gift from her mother long ago. It felt heavy against her chest, a reminder of the lineage she was fighting to preserve. Ravenswood Castle was a stark contrast to Ashmere. Where Ashmere was crumbling and faded, Ravenswood was imposing and formidable, a fortress built of dark, forbidding stone. It stood on a craggy outcrop, overlooking a vast, windswept moor, its battlements silhouetted against the darkening sky like the teeth of some monstrous beast. The very air around it seemed to hum with a sense of power, of barely contained menace. As they rode through the massive iron gates, Isolde felt a shiver of apprehension crawl down her spine. The courtyard was bustling with activity, men-at-arms drilling with swords and spears, stable hands tending to war horses, servants scurrying about their duties. The sounds of clashing steel and shouted commands echoed off the stone walls, creating a cacophony that made Isolde's head spin. Master Gareth led her through a maze of corridors, each one colder and more imposing than the last. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of battle and conquest, the faces of the warriors fierce and unrelenting. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic and faintly unsettling, like the lingering smell of blood. Finally, they reached a pair of massive oak doors, guarded by two knights in full armor, their faces hidden behind visors. Master Gareth spoke a few words in a low voice, and the knights stepped aside, the doors swinging inward with a groan that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the castle. The chamber beyond was surprisingly warm, a fire roaring in a large hearth at the far end. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with leather-bound tomes and scrolls. A large, intricately carved desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat Sir Aldrich Blackwell. He was not what Isolde had expected. She had imagined a hulking brute, a man whose physical presence alone would be intimidating. Instead, she saw a man of medium height, lean and wiry, with a face that was more striking than handsome. His hair was black, streaked with silver at the temples, and his eyes, a piercing shade of gray, seemed to bore into her very soul. He wore a simple, dark tunic, unadorned except for a silver chain bearing a raven's claw, the symbol of his house. He rose as she entered, his movements fluid and graceful, like a predator rising to greet its prey. "Lady Isolde," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "Welcome to Ravenswood." Isolde curtsied, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Sir Aldrich," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I thank you for receiving me." He gestured towards a chair opposite the desk. "Please be seated." Isolde sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated, though her stomach was clenched in a knot of fear. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You have come seeking my aid," he said finally, his voice devoid of warmth. Your father's debts are substantial. They are, Isolde agreed, her voice tight. And I am prepared to offer whatever is necessary to repay them. A flicker of amusement crossed his lips. Whatever is necessary, he repeated, his voice laced with a hint of mockery. You are a brave woman, Lady Isolde. But I doubt you truly understand the meaning of those words. I understand that my family's honor is at stake, Isolde said, her voice rising slightly. And I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to preserve it. He leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto hers. Your father's debts are beyond mere gold, Lady Isolde. They require a more personal form of repayment. Isolde felt a chill run through her. She had known this was coming, had braced herself for it, but hearing the words spoken aloud still sent a wave of dread through her. What is it you require? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a slow, cruel smile that did not reach his eyes. I require a wife, Lady Isolde. A wife of noble birth, a woman who can bring prestige and stability to my house. A woman who can bear me an heir. Isolde stared at him, her mind reeling. She had expected a demand for land, for a share of Ashenmere's dwindling resources, even for a period of indentured servitude. But this was beyond anything she had imagined. He wanted to marry her. He wanted to bind her to him, to this dark, forbidding castle, to a life of what? Obedience? Submission? You cannot be serious, she stammered, her voice trembling. I assure you, Lady Isolde, I am perfectly serious, he replied, his voice smooth and unwavering. It is a simple bargain. Your hand in marriage, in exchange for the cancellation of your father's debts. Your family's honor is restored, and I gain a wife. Everyone benefits. Except me, Isolde thought, her mind racing. She would be trapped, a prisoner in this gilded cage, bound to a man she barely knew, a man who was rumored to be as cold and ruthless as the winter winds. The falcon on her chain felt impossibly heavy, pressing down on her as though mirroring her fate, pinned and unable to fly. She was to be his, and she had asked for this very bargain. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Tapestry Hall. Isolde's silence hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight pressing down on the chamber. She stared at Aldrich Blackwell, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Disbelief, fear, anger, and a sliver of something else. Something akin to a desperate, reluctant admiration. He was a man who took what he wanted, a man who made his own rules, a man who was utterly, terrifyingly in control. I need time to consider, she managed to say, her voice strained. Aldrich raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his gray eyes. Time? He repeated. Lady Isolde, your father's creditors are not known for their patience. They are circling like vultures, waiting for Ashenmere to fall. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. I am offering you a way out. A chance to save your family, to preserve your legacy. Do not mistake my offer for generosity. It is a transaction, nothing more. His words were like a slap in the face, a brutal reminder of her powerlessness. She was a pawn in this game, a piece to be moved at his will. And yet, she couldn't deny the truth in what he said. He was offering her a lifeline, a way to avoid the complete ruin of her house. I understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But marriage is a sacred vow. It is not something to be entered into lightly, as a transaction. A flicker of something surprise? Respect? Crossed his face, quickly masked by his usual impassive expression. Indeed, he said, but circumstances often dictate our choices, do they not? And your circumstances, Lady Isolde, are dire. He rose from his chair and walked towards the fireplace, his back to her. The firelight danced on his dark hair, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. I am not a cruel man, Lady Isolde, he said, his voice softer now, almost reflective. I do not take pleasure in the suffering of others. But I am a practical man. I see what needs to be done, and I do it. Without hesitation, without remorse. He turned back to face her, his gray eyes intense. I will give you until dawn to make your decision. But know this, if you refuse, Your father's debts will be called in. Ashenmere will be lost, your family disgraced. You will be left with nothing. He gestured towards the door. Master Gareth will show you to your chambers. You will find everything you need there. Consider my offer carefully, Lady Isolde. Your fate, and the fate of your family, rests in your hands. Isolde rose, her legs shaky, her mind reeling. She curtsied, her gaze fixed on the floor. Thank you, Sir Aldrich, she murmured. She followed Master Gareth out of the chamber, her head bowed, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and desperation. The corridors of Ravenswood seemed even more oppressive now, the tapestries depicting scenes of battle and conquest seeming to mock her plight. She was trapped, a bird caught in a gilded cage, her wings clipped, her spirit broken. Master Gareth led her to a large, richly appointed chamber. The walls were hung with tapestries of a more peaceful nature, depicting scenes of hunting and hawking. A fire burned brightly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. A large, four-poster bed dominated the center of the room, its curtains drawn back to reveal crisp, white linen. Will there be anything else, my lady? Master Gareth asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Isolde shook her head. No, thank you, she murmured. He bowed and departed, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed through the silent chamber. Isolde sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. She looked around the room, at the luxurious furnishings, at the fire burning merrily in the hearth. It was a beautiful prison, but a prison nonetheless. She walked over to the window, her gaze drawn to the vast, windswept moor stretching out before her. The wind howled outside, a mournful sound that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. She thought of her father, lying weak and helpless in his bed. She thought of her ancestors, the brave men and women who had built Ashenmere, who had fought and died to protect their land. And she thought of Aldrich Blackwell, the man who held her fate in his hands. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She was trapped, with no escape. Or was there? A flicker of defiance sparked within her, a tiny ember of hope in the darkness. She was a daughter of Ashenmere, a woman of strength and resilience. She would not surrender easily. She would find a way to survive, to protect her family, even if it meant making a deal with darkness. But as the whispers of the wind seemed to echo the hushed, fearful conversations she'd overheard between servants in the tapestry hall, she knew that survival here would require more than just compliance. It would require cunning, and a strength she wasn't sure she possessed. Chapter 4. The Falcon and the Dove. The hours before dawn were a torment. Isolde paced the confines of her chamber, sleep a distant, unattainable dream. The fire had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, transforming familiar objects into grotesque shapes. Every creak of the castle timbers, every rustle of the wind, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was a prisoner in this place, her fate hanging in the balance. She tried to pray, but the words felt hollow, empty. Her faith, once a source of comfort and strength, now seemed to waver in the face of such overwhelming despair. She was caught between two impossible choices, ruin or a loveless marriage to a man feared throughout the land. She thought of escaping, of fleeing into the night, but the thought was quickly dismissed. Where would she go? How would she survive? And what of her father? He would be left to face the consequences of her actions, his already fragile health further imperiled. No, escape was not an option. She had to face her fate, to accept the bargain she had struck. But acceptance did not mean surrender. She would find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to protect herself and her family, even within the confines of this marriage. As the first faint light of dawn began to creep through the window, Isolde made her decision. She would marry Aldrich Blackwell. She would become his wife, bear him an heir, and secure the future of Ashenmere. But she would not be a passive victim. She would use her wits, her courage, and her determination to carve out a life for herself, to find a measure of happiness, even in this darkness. She rose from the bed, her body stiff and aching, her mind surprisingly clear. She washed her face in the basin of cold water, the chill shocking her awake. She brushed her hair, the long, dark strands falling around her shoulders like a protective cloak. She donned the same dark green gown she had worn the previous day, its simplicity a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. She found a small, wooden box on the dressing table, containing a brush, a comb, and a few other necessities. And, tucked away in a corner, a small, leather-bound book. It was a book of prayers and meditations, a gift from her mother. Isolde opened it, her fingers tracing the familiar words, her heart seeking solace in the ancient wisdom. A knock on the door startled her. It was Master Gareth, his face as impassive as ever. "Sir Aldrich awaits you, my lady," he said. Isolde nodded, her heart pounding against her ribs. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She followed Master Gareth through the silent corridors, the only sound their footsteps echoing on the stone floors. They reached the chamber where she had met Aldrich the previous evening. The fire was burning brightly, casting a warm glow over the room. Aldrich stood by the window, his back to the door, his gaze fixed on the rising sun. He turned as she entered, his gray eyes searching hers. "You have made your decision, Lady Isolde?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Isolde met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I have," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "I will marry you, Sir Aldrich." A flicker of something satisfaction, relief, crossed his face, quickly masked. "Wise choice," he said. "I expected no less." He walked towards her, his movements fluid and graceful. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze intense. "Know this, Lady Isolde," he said, his voice low and resonant. "I will honor my part of the bargain. Your father's debts will be settled. Ashenmere will be safe. But I expect your loyalty, your obedience, and your cooperation." "I understand," Isolde replied, her voice firm. "But I am not a dove, Sir Aldrich, to be caged and tamed. I am a falcon, and I will not be broken." A hint of a smile played on his lips. "A falcon, you say?" he repeated. "Perhaps. But even falcons can be trained, Lady Isolde. And I am a skilled falconer." He reached out and gently touched the silver falcon pendant she wore. The metal felt cold beneath his fingertips. The contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt through her, a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite define. The dawn was breaking, but the true test of her resolve was only just beginning. Chapter 5. Scars of the Forgotten War. The wedding was a stark, austere affair, conducted in the castle chapel with only a handful of witnesses present. Master Gareth, a few of Aldrich's most trusted knights, and a somber-faced priest who seemed more accustomed to performing last rites than marriage ceremonies. Isolde wore a gown of deep blue velvet, borrowed from Ravenswood stores, its richness a stark contrast to the simple gown she had intended to wear. It felt foreign, heavy, a symbol of her new, unwanted life. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. Only the exchange of vows, spoken in low, solemn tones, and the cold weight of a gold band on her finger. Aldrich's touch, as he placed the ring on her hand, was surprisingly gentle, but his eyes remained distant, unreadable. He was fulfilling a duty, nothing more. And Isolde, in turn, felt like a participant in a play, reciting lines she had memorized but did not feel. After the ceremony, there was a small, formal meal in a private dining chamber. Aldrich sat at the head of the table, Isolde at his side. The conversation was sparse, punctuated by long silences. Aldrich spoke mostly to Master Gareth, discussing matters of estate management and military preparedness. Isolde ate little, her stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and resentment. She observed Aldrich closely, trying to glean some insight into the man she had just married. He was a man of contradictions. He could be ruthless and demanding, yet he also possessed a quiet dignity, a sense of unwavering purpose. She noticed the scars on his hands, thin, white lines that spoke of battles fought and wounds endured. And she noticed, too, a faint sadness in his eyes, a hint of a past that haunted him. Later that evening, as she sat alone in her chamber, now officially their chamber, a thought that sent a shiver of apprehension through her, she heard a soft knock on the door. She expected Master Gareth, but it was Aldrich himself who entered. He stood for a moment, silhouetted against the firelight, his expression unreadable. "I trust you are finding your accommodation satisfactory?" he asked, his voice formal. "They are adequate," Isolde replied, her voice tight. He walked towards a fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I know this is not the marriage you envisioned for yourself, Lady Isolde," he said, his voice softer now. "But I assure you, I will not be a cruel husband. I will provide for you, protect you, and treat you with respect." "Respect is not love, Sir Aldrich," Isolde said, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to face her, his gray eyes searching hers. "Love is a luxury, Lady Isolde," he said. "One that few of us can afford, especially in these times." He paused, then added, "I had a wife, once. Many years ago. Before the war." Isolde's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time he had spoken of his past, of anything personal. What would happen to her? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant past. "She died, along with our child, during the siege of Northwood. A fever. It took them both within days." Isolde felt a pang of sympathy for him, a flicker of understanding in the darkness. He had known loss, had suffered a pain that she could only imagine. The scars on his hands were not the only ones he carried. "I am sorry," she said softly. He nodded, his expression still distant. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but the scars remain." He turned back to her, his gray eyes intense. "I do not expect you to love me, Lady Isolde," he said, "but I do expect your loyalty. And I hope, in time, we can find a measure of peace together." He was about to leave when, with a newly found boldness, she asked, "What war, Sir Aldrich?" He paused at the door, a shadow falling across. He spoke without turning. "The Forgotten War, they call it now, because no one wishes to remember the bloodshed." And with those words, a deeper chill than any Northumbrian winter could conjure settled around her heart. Chapter 6. The Price of a Lady's Honor. The first few weeks of Isolde's marriage were a strange, unsettling blend of formality and intimacy. She and Aldrich shared meals, exchanged polite conversation, and occupied the same chamber, yet they remained strangers, separated by a vast gulf of unspoken emotions and unshared histories. He was a man of routine, rising early, spending his days overseeing the castle and its surrounding lands, and retiring late. Isolde, left largely to her own devices, explored the castle, finding solace in the library and the small, neglected chapel. She learned more about Aldrich from the servants, from the hushed whispers and guarded glances. They spoke of his bravery in battle, his unwavering loyalty to the crown, and his strictness. They also spoke of his sorrow, of the loss of his first wife and child, a wound that time had not fully healed. Isolde began to see the man behind the mask, the warrior burdened by duty and haunted by loss. She saw his vulnerability, his loneliness, and his yearning for something more. And she began to feel a flicker of compassion for him, a reluctant understanding that tempered her initial fear and resentment. One evening, as they sat at dinner, Aldrich spoke of the upcoming Harvest Festival, a tradition that had been neglected in recent years due to the ongoing conflicts. "It is important to maintain the traditions," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It gives the people hope, a sense of continuity." "It has been many years since Ashenmere hosted a harvest festival," Isolde said, her voice soft. Aldrich looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Perhaps we could revive the tradition," he said. "It would be a way to unite our lands, to show our people that we are strong, that we are together." Isolde felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of purpose that had been missing since her arrival at Ravenswood. "I would like that very much," she said. "I could help with the preparations. I have experience in organizing such events." Aldrich nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I would appreciate that, Lady Isolde," he said. And so, Isolde threw herself into the preparations for the Harvest Festival, finding a welcome distraction from the complexities of her marriage. She worked alongside the servants, overseeing the decorations, the food, and the entertainment. She discovered a talent for organization, a knack for bringing people together, a strength she had not realized she possessed. As the day of the festival approached, a sense of excitement filled the castle, a palpable energy that dispelled some of the gloom. Isolde felt a sense of accomplishment, a pride in what she had achieved. She had taken a small step towards making Ravenswood her home, towards finding her place in this new life. But the festival also brought unexpected challenges. One evening, as Isolde was overseeing the placement of the harvest decorations in the Great Hall, she overheard a conversation between two of Aldrich's knights. They were speaking of a rumored plot against the king, a conspiracy involving several powerful noble families. And they mentioned Aldrich's name, suggesting that he was somehow involved. Isolde's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should dismiss it as idle gossip, as the unfounded rumors that often circulated in such circles. But she couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that something was not right. She remembered the whispered warnings about Aldrich, the rumors of his ruthlessness, his darkness. She decided to confront him, to ask him directly about the rumors. It was a risky move, a breach of the unspoken agreement between them. But she couldn't live with the uncertainty, with the fear that she had married a man who was involved in treason. She found the courage in a flagon of spiced wine, which she'd requested be placed near the decorations for the workers. She would need courage for the confrontation to come, with truth the ultimate price of her honor. She steeled her gaze, knowing the price of honor could be very steep indeed. Chapter 7. Beneath a Treacherous Moon. Isolde found Aldrich in his study, poring over maps and documents, the candlelight casting long shadows on his face. He looked up as she entered, his expression questioning. "Isolde," he said, his voice neutral. "Is something amiss?" She hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had rehearsed the words in her mind, but now, faced with his intense gaze, she found it difficult to speak. "I overheard something," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Something that disturbed me." He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "And what was that?" She took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I heard some of your knights speaking of a plot, a conspiracy against the king. And they mentioned your name." The silence that followed was deafening. Aldrich's expression did not change, but his eyes seemed to darken, to become even more intense. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "And what did you think, Isolde?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Did you believe them?" Isolde felt a shiver of fear run through her, but she stood her ground. I do not know what to believe," she said. "But I had to ask you. I had to know the truth." He rose from his chair and walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze locking onto hers. "The truth," he said, his voice a low murmur, "is often a dangerous thing, Lady Isolde, especially in these times." He paused, then added, "There are indeed plots and conspiracies. The kingdom is rife with them. And yes, my name is mentioned, because I am a threat to those who would betray the king." Isolde's heart skipped a beat. He was not denying his involvement, but he was framing it in a different light. "You are loyal to the king?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "Loyalty is a complex thing, Lady Isolde," he said. "It can be bought, sold, and betrayed. But my loyalty to the crown is unwavering, even if it means making difficult choices." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly gentle. "You are a curious woman, Isolde," he said, "and a brave one. But curiosity can be dangerous, especially for a woman in your position." His words sent a chill down her spine. He was warning her, telling her to stay out of his affairs, to remain silent and obedient. But she couldn't do that. She couldn't live with the uncertainty, with the fear that she was married to a traitor. She pulled back, her gaze defiant, emboldened by the wine. "I am your wife, Aldrich," she said. "I have a right to know. I will not be kept in the dark, like some ignorant child." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by something that looked almost like admiration. "You have spirit, Isolde," he said. "I will give you that. But spirit can be broken, and trust, once lost, is difficult to regain." "Then earn my trust, Aldrich," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Tell me the truth. Tell me what is happening." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Very well," he said. "I will tell you. But know this. What I am about to reveal could put both our lives in danger." He motioned towards the chairs in the corner, away from any potential listening ears outside the heavy oak door. The moon shone brightly through the window, casting a treacherous light on the room, highlighting a situation far more dangerous than she had imagined. The price of her honor, she now realized, could very well be her life. Chapter 8. The Serpent in the Garden. Aldrich led Isolde to a pair of chairs near the fireplace, far from the door and any potential eavesdroppers. He poured 2 goblets of wine, handing one to her. The liquid was dark and rich, its scent filling the room. Isolde took a sip, her hand trembling slightly. "The situation is more complex than you realize, Isolde," Aldrich began, his voice low and serious. "There is indeed a plot against the king, but it is not a simple rebellion. It is a serpent, coiled at the heart of the court, its venom spreading slowly, poisoning everything it touches." He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. "The leader of this conspiracy is Lord Reginald of Northwood, the very man who was responsible for the siege, where my wife and child died." Isolde's breath caught in her throat. The name was familiar, a name she had heard whispered in connection with Aldrich's past, with his sorrow. Now, she understood the depth of his hatred, the reason for his unwavering loyalty to the king. "He seeks to overthrow the king and install himself as ruler," Aldrich continued. "He has gathered a following of ambitious nobles, men who are dissatisfied with the current regime, men who are willing to betray their oaths for power and wealth." And your involvement?" Isolde asked, her voice hesitant. Aldrich looked at her, his gray eyes intense. "I am playing a dangerous game, Isolde," he said. "I am pretending to be one of them, gaining their trust, learning their plans, so that I can expose them and destroy them." Isolde felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a surge of fear. He was walking a tightrope, risking his life to protect the king, to avenge his past. And she was now caught in the middle of it, a pawn in his dangerous game. "But why tell me?" she asked. "Why risk exposing yourself?" He smiled, a sad, almost wistful smile. "Because I trust you, Isolde," he said. "Despite your curiosity, despite your defiance, I see your strength, your loyalty, your integrity, and I need your help." Isolde's heart skipped a beat. He trusted her. He needed her. It was a strange, unexpected feeling, a flicker of warmth in the darkness. What can I do?" she asked. "I need you to be my eyes and ears in the castle," he said. "To observe, to listen, to report anything suspicious. Reginald has spies everywhere, even here, among my own men. I need someone I can trust, someone who is above suspicion." He paused, then added, "It is a dangerous task, Isolde. If you are discovered, the consequences could be severe. But I believe you are capable. I believe you are strong enough." Isolde felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and excitement. She was being asked to play a part in this dangerous game, to risk her life for a cause she now believed in. She was no longer just a pawn, she was a player. "I will do it," she said, her voice firm. "I will be your eyes and ears. I will help you expose the serpent." He nodded, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Isolde," he said. "You are a brave woman. And a valuable ally." He rose from his chair and walked towards the window, his gaze fixed on the moonlit landscape. "The Harvest Festival will be the perfect opportunity," he said. "Reginald will be here, along with many of his followers. It will be a chance to observe them, to gather evidence." He looked at her. A serpent was indeed in their garden, and its venom was far-reaching. It was a risk, but one she was now willing to take. Chapter 9. A dance of shadows and silk. The harvest festival dawned bright and clear, the air crisp and cool, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke. Ravenswood Castle was transformed, its stern facade softened by decorations of colorful ribbons, garlands of flowers, and sheaves of wheat. The courtyard bustled with activity, servants scurrying about, vendors setting up their stalls, and guests arriving in their finest attire. Isolde, dressed in a gown of deep green velvet, embroidered with silver thread, felt a surge of pride as she surveyed the scene. She had worked tirelessly to make this day a success, to create a sense of unity and celebration, to mask the underlying tension that simmered beneath the surface. Aldrich, standing beside her, looked equally pleased. He wore a tunic of dark blue, his only adornment the silver raven's claw on his chain. He looked every inch the lord of the castle, imposing and authoritative, yet there was a subtle warmth in his eyes, a hint of appreciation for her efforts. "You have done well, Isolde," he said, his voice low and approving. "This is impressive." "Thank you, Aldrich," she replied, her voice equally soft. "I am glad you are pleased." Their moment of shared satisfaction was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Reginald of Northwood. He was a tall, imposing man, with a handsome face marred by a cruel twist to his lips and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a rich, fur-lined cloak, and his fingers were adorned with rings. He was accompanied by a retinue of knights and servants, all equally lavishly dressed. Isolde felt a chill run through her as she watched him approach. This was the man who had caused Aldrich so much pain, the man who was plotting to overthrow the king. And she was expected to play the part of the gracious hostess, to smile and make polite conversation, while secretly observing his every move. Aldrich greeted Reginald with a formal bow, his expression unreadable. "Lord Reginald," he said, his voice neutral. "Welcome to Ravenswood." Reginald returned the bow, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Sir Aldrich," he replied, "it is good to be here. You have outdone yourself with this festivity." He then turned his attention to Isolde, his gaze lingering on her with a hint of appraisal. "And this must be your lovely wife, Lady Isolde," he said, his voice smooth and oily. "I had heard rumors of your beauty, but they did not do you justice." Isolde forced a smile, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Thank you, Lord Reginald," she said, her voice steady. "It is an honor to have you as our guest." The introductions continued, and Isolde found herself drawn into a dance of shadows and silk, a carefully choreographed performance of courtly manners and veiled threats. She observed Reginald closely, noting his interactions with the other guests, his subtle gestures, his whispered conversations. She saw the way he looked at Aldrich, a mixture of suspicion and contempt. And she saw the way his followers watched him, their loyalty bordering on fanaticism. As the day wore on, the festivities continued. There were games of skill and chance, displays of falconry and archery, and a feast of roasted meats, fresh bread, and spiced wine. Isolde played her part, mingling with the guests, engaging in polite conversation, all the while keeping a watchful eye on Reginald and his men. She noticed a pattern in his movements, a series of clandestine meetings with certain individuals, a subtle exchange of coded messages. She realized that he was using the festival as a cover, a way to communicate with his co-conspirators without arousing suspicion. She knew she had to inform Aldrich and that she must do so at the first opportune time, discreetly. It was a dance of words and gestures and glances. The night wore on, and the dangers became as intoxicating as the wine. Chapter 10. The Weight of a Broken Vow. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Isolde sought a moment to speak with Aldrich privately. She found him standing alone on a balcony overlooking the festivities, his gaze fixed on the dancers below. "Aldrich," she said softly, approaching him. "I need to speak with you." He turned, his expression questioning. "What is it, Isolde?" She hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had gathered enough information to confirm her suspicions, but she knew that revealing it would put them both in greater danger. "I have been watching Reginald," she began, her voice low and urgent. "He is using the festival as a cover. He is meeting with his co-conspirators, exchanging messages. Aldrich's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me everything," he said. Isolde recounted her observations, describing the individuals Reginald had met with, the coded messages she had intercepted, the subtle gestures she had witnessed. She saw the anger flash in Aldrich's eyes, the barely contained fury that simmered beneath his calm exterior. "He is bolder than I thought," Aldrich said, his voice a low growl. "He is using my own home, my own hospitality, to plot against the king." He paused, then added, "We must act quickly. We cannot allow him to continue his treachery." "What would you plan to do?" Isolde asked, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her, his gray eyes intense. "I will expose him," he said. "I will reveal his plot to the king, and I will bring him to justice." "But how?" Isolde asked. "He is a powerful man with many allies. It will be dangerous." Aldrich smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "Danger is my constant companion, Isolde," he said. "And I am not afraid of it." He reached out to touch her cheek. "I have evidence," he continued. "Documents, letters, testimonies. I have been gathering them for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment is now." He paused, then he looked down. "There's something else," Isolde continued. "One of the serving girls, she's from Northwood." She recognized Reginald Stewart. Said he was the one who ordered the gates closed during the siege. Prevented anyone from escaping the fever. Aldrich's face went white, his hands clenching into fists. The pain in his eyes was raw, unbearable. It was a pain Isolde now understood, a pain she felt a strange, fierce urge to soothe. I didn't know," she whispered, her own eyes filling with tears. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to regain control. "It is not your burden to bear, Isolde," he said, his voice hoarse. "But it is mine, and I will see it through." He looked at her then. "The vow I took to avenge the deaths and protect the crown. I must act, and I will, Isolde, tonight." His voice had a new resolve. It was a vow that had been broken by another man, a vow that Aldrich would uphold, even if it cost him everything. She looked at him, knowing there was no going back. The weight of a broken vow fell squarely on them, with the truth about to come to light. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Silent Cloister. Following the revelation, Aldrich and Isolde moved swiftly, their actions guided by a shared sense of urgency and purpose. Aldrich summoned his most trusted knights, men he knew were loyal to the crown, men who would not hesitate to act against Reginald and his followers. He outlined his plan, his voice low and resolute, his orders precise and unwavering. Isolde, meanwhile, sought refuge in the small, neglected chapel, the only place in the castle that offered her a sense of peace and solace. She lit a candle, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, the scent of incense filling the air. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly, her lips moving in a silent prayer. She prayed for Aldrich's safety, for the success of his plan, and for the strength to face whatever lay ahead. She prayed for the king, for the kingdom, and for the souls of those who had been lost in the forgotten war. And she prayed, too, for herself, for the courage to endure, to overcome the fear that gnawed at her heart. As she prayed, she heard a sound, a faint rustling from behind the altar. She froze, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had thought she was alone, but now she realized that someone, or something, was hiding in the shadows. She rose slowly, her hand reaching for the small dagger she had concealed beneath her gown. She had learned to be cautious, to be prepared for any threat. She moved towards the altar, her steps silent, her senses alert. She rounded the altar, her dagger raised, ready to strike. And then she saw it. Not a person, but a small, leather-bound book, lying open on the floor. It was the same book of prayers and meditations she had found in her chamber, the one that had belonged to her mother. She lowered her dagger, her heart still racing. How had the book gotten here? She had left it in her chamber. Had someone brought it here? And if so, why? She picked up the book, her fingers tracing the familiar words, her mind searching for answers. She opened it to a random page, and her eyes fell upon a passage that sent a shiver down her spine. Beware the whispers of the serpent, for they carry the venom of deceit. Trust not those who speak with forked tongues, for they seek only to destroy. Seek the truth in the silence, and find strength in the echoes of the past. The words resonated with her, echoing the events of the past few weeks, the whispers of conspiracy, the treachery of Reginald. But they also hinted at something more, something hidden, something she had yet to uncover. She closed the book, her mind racing. The passage felt like a warning, a message from beyond the grave, a guide to navigate the treacherous path ahead. She realized that the book was not just a collection of prayers, it was a key, a clue to unlocking a deeper mystery. As she clutched it, the echoes of the past whispered around. She knew she had to examine the book more closely, to search for hidden meanings, for clues that might help her unravel the truth. She heard movement and voices down below in the courtyard. It had begun. Chapter 12. The Lion and the Lamb. The sounds of the confrontation echoed up to the chapel, a cacophony of shouts, clashing steel, and cries of pain. Isolde's heart pounded in her chest, her fear for Aldrich overwhelming. She wanted to rush to his side, to offer whatever help she could, but she knew she had to remain hidden, to protect the information she had gathered. She clutched the leather-bound book tightly, her fingers tracing the worn edges, her mind racing. She had to find a way to decipher its secrets, to unlock the hidden messages that might help Aldrich, that might save them both. She returned to her chamber, locking the door behind her. She lit a candle, placing it on the small table beside the bed. She opened the book, her eyes scanning the pages, searching for anything that might stand out, any clue that might shed light on the situation. She noticed that certain words and phrases were underlined, some faintly, others more boldly. She recognized her mother's handwriting, the delicate script she had known since childhood. But there was something else, something different. Some of the underlined words were not prayers or meditations, but names. Names of people, places, and events. She began to write down the names, arranging them in chronological order, trying to make sense of them. She recognized some of the names, people who had been involved in the Forgotten War, people who had been close to her father, to Aldrich. And then she saw a name that made her blood run cold, Reginald of Northwood. His name was underlined multiple times, linked to other names, to events that seemed to contradict the official narrative of the war. She realized that the book was not just a collection of prayers, it was a journal, a secret record of events that had been deliberately hidden, suppressed. She continued to read, her heart pounding faster with each revelation. She discovered that Reginald had not been a victim of the siege, as Aldrich believed, but a perpetrator. He had not only ordered the gates closed, preventing anyone from escaping the fever, but he had also deliberately spread the disease, using it as a weapon to weaken his enemies. And then she saw the most shocking revelation of all. Aldrich's wife and child had not died of the fever. They had been murdered by Reginald's men, on his orders. Isolde gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The truth was more horrific than she could have ever imagined. Aldrich had been living a lie, believing in a false narrative, his grief and his quest for vengeance based on a deception. She had to find him, and she had to decide whether to reveal the truth. The sounds of the fighting were dying down, replaced by an eerie silence. She knew that the confrontation was over, that one side had prevailed. But which side? Was Aldrich alive? Was he safe? The book lay before her, a powerful and terrifying piece of evidence. She rose, preparing to leave, to face the reality awaiting her. But who would she find? The lion? Or the lamb led to the slaughter? Chapter 13. A storm of swords and secrets. Isolde emerged from her chamber, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The castle was eerily silent, the sounds of celebration replaced by an oppressive stillness. The corridors were deserted, the tapestries seeming to watch her with silent disapproval. She made her way to the great hall, her steps echoing on the stone floors. As she approached, she saw a flicker of light, heard the murmur of voices. She hesitated, her hand on the door, bracing herself for what she might find. She pushed open the door, and the scene that greeted her was one of chaos and carnage. The hall was in disarray, the tables overturned, the decorations torn down, the floor stained with blood. Bodies lay scattered across the room, knights and servants, their faces contorted in death. And in the center of the hall stood Aldrich. He was covered in blood, his own and that of his enemies. His sword was still in his hand, dripping with crimson. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes burned with a fierce, triumphant light. He saw her, and his expression softened, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Isolde," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're safe." She rushed to his side, her heart overflowing with emotion. "Aldrich," she said, her voice trembling. Are you all right?" He nodded, his gaze searching hers. "I am," he said. "It is over. Reginald and his followers are defeated." He looked around the hall, his expression grim. "There has been much bloodshed," he said. "Too much." Isolde looked at the bodies, at the faces of the dead. She saw Reginald's body lying near the fireplace, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, his face frozen in a mask of surprise and terror. She felt a pang of pity for him, for the choices he had made, for the life he had wasted. "It was necessary," Aldrich said, his voice hardening. "He would have destroyed the kingdom, plunged us into another war." He paused, then added, "I have sent word to the king. He will be here soon, to assess the situation, to administer justice." Isolde nodded, her mind racing. She had to tell him the truth about his wife, about his child, about Reginald's ultimate betrayal. But she hesitated, fearing the impact it would have on him, fearing that it would break him. "Aldrich," she began, her voice trembling. "There is something you need to know." He looked at her, his gray eyes questioning. "What is it, Isolde?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself for his reaction. She reached into the folds of her gown and pulled out the leather-bound book. This belonged to my mother," she said. "It is a journal, a record of events that were hidden. It reveals the truth about the siege of Northwood, about your wife and child." Aldrich's face went white, his eyes widening in disbelief. He took the book from her, his hands trembling. He opened it, his gaze scanning the pages, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. The storm of swords had ended, leaving only silence and the secrets to be unearthed. The truth, she knew, would be more devastating than any blade. Chapter 14. The Unveiling of Truth. Aldrich read through the journal, his face a mask of shock and disbelief, then slowly morphing into a terrifying, controlled rage. Isolde watched him, her heart aching for the pain she knew he was experiencing, the pain she had unleashed. She had ripped open a wound she had hoped to heal, exposing a truth far more brutal than he could have ever imagined. He closed the book, his hands clenched tightly, his knuckles white. He looked up at Isolde, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of anguish and fury. "They were murdered," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "He ordered them killed." Isolde nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. "I am so sorry, Aldrich," she said. I did not know how to tell you." He turned away from her, his body shaking with suppressed emotion. He walked towards a fireplace, his gaze fixed on the cold, empty hearth. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, his silence deafening. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse and broken. "All these years," he said, "all these years I have lived with the belief that they died of the fever, that it was a tragedy, a cruel twist of fate." He paused, then added, "And all along it was a lie, a deliberate, calculated act of murder." He turned back to face her, his eyes blazing with a fury she had never seen before. "I will make him pay," he said, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "I will make them all pay." Isolde knew that he was not speaking of Reginald, who was already dead. He was speaking of Reginald's family, his allies, anyone who had been complicit in the plot, in the murder of his wife and child. "Aldrich," she said, her voice pleading, You cannot seek vengeance on everyone. It will consume you." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Vengeance is all I have left, Isolde, he said. It is the only thing that keeps me going. But what about the king? She asked. What about justice? He smiled, a cold, humorless smile. Justice? He repeated. There is no justice in this world, Isolde. Only power. And I will use whatever power I have to avenge them. He held the book up. She knew that she had unleashed something dark and dangerous, something that could destroy him, that could destroy everything they had built together. She had revealed the truth, but she had also opened a Pandora's box of pain and vengeance. He walked towards the window, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The dawn was breaking, casting a pale, cold light on the scene of carnage. The unveiling of truth had changed everything. The reckoning, she knew, was only just beginning. Chapter 15. Blood on the Altar. The arrival of the king and his retinue brought a semblance of order to the chaos of Ravenswood. The great hall was cleared, the bodies removed, and the castle prepared for the royal presence. Aldrich, though still consumed by grief and rage, presented himself to the king, offering a formal report of the events, presenting the evidence he had gathered against Reginald and his conspirators. The king, a stern but just man, listened intently, his expression grave. He questioned Aldrich, examined the documents, and spoke with the surviving witnesses. He was visibly shaken by the scale of the conspiracy, by the treachery that had been uncovered. He ordered the arrest of Reginald's remaining allies, those who had been implicated in the plot. He promised swift and severe justice, vowing to cleanse the kingdom of the corruption that had taken root. But Isolde could see the turmoil in Aldrich's eyes, the barely contained fury that simmered beneath his calm exterior. He had presented the evidence, he had fulfilled his duty to the crown, but his thirst for vengeance remained unquenched. She found him in the chapel, standing before the altar, his gaze fixed on the stained glass window depicting St. George slaying the dragon. He was not praying, she knew. He was plotting. Aldrich, she said softly, approaching him. He turned, his expression unreadable. Isolde, he said, his voice neutral. What will you do now? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her, his gray eyes cold and distant. I will do what I must, he said. I will finish what Reginald started. But the king has promised justice, she said. You must let him handle it. He smiled, a bitter, cynical smile. The king's justice is slow and imperfect, he said. It will not bring back my wife and child. It will not ease the pain. He paused, then added, I have made a vow, Isolde. A vow to avenge their deaths. And I will not break it. But vengeance is not the answer, she pleaded. It will only lead to more bloodshed, more pain. He turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the altar. There is already blood on the altar, Isolde, he said, his voice low and resonant. The blood of the innocent. And I will not rest until it is cleansed. He reached out and touched the altar, his fingers tracing the cold stone. He was not speaking of the physical altar, she knew. He was speaking of the altar of his heart, of the sacred space that had been defiled by Reginald's treachery. Isolde felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had tried to reason with him, to appeal to his sense of justice, to his compassion. But he was beyond her reach, lost in a darkness of his own making. And as he held his hands, still covered with traces of blood, up toward the window, she feared he meant to add more blood. The altar before them, and the altar of his heart, might soon be overflowing, and she could do nothing to stop it. Chapter 16. The Raven's Flight. Aldrich's descent into vengeance was swift and brutal. He used his influence, his knowledge of the conspiracy, and his network of informants to track down and eliminate anyone even remotely connected to Reginald's plot. He acted outside the law, defying the king's authority, becoming a law unto himself. Villages that had harbored Reginald's supporters were raided, homes burned, and people questioned. Ruthlessly. Isolde watched in horror as the man she had begun to understand, to care for, transformed into a cold, ruthless avenger. He was consumed by his grief and his rage, his heart hardened, his soul darkened. He became a stranger to her, a man she no longer recognized. She tried to intervene, to plead with him, to remind him of his duty, of his honor. But he brushed aside her concerns, dismissing her pleas as the naive sentiments of a woman who did not understand the harsh realities of the world. "This is not justice, Aldrich," she said, her voice breaking. "This is madness." He looked at her, his gray eyes devoid of emotion. "This is the only justice they deserve, Isolde," he said. "They took everything from me, and I will take everything from them." He became increasingly distant, spending his days hunting down his enemies and his nights elsewhere. He no longer shared her chamber, no longer sought her company. He was a ghost in his own castle, a haunting presence that filled Isolde with dread. One evening, she found him in the stables, preparing to leave on another one of his missions. He was dressed in black, his face hidden in shadow, his sword at his side. He looked like a dark angel of death, a raven poised for flight. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. He did not answer, simply mounting his horse, his movements swift and efficient. "Aldrich, please," she said, her voice pleading. "Do not do this. Do not become the monster you are hunting." He looked at her, his gray eyes cold and unforgiving. "It is too late, Isolde," he said. "The monster is already here." He spurred his horse, galloping out of the castle gates, disappearing into the darkness. Isolde watched him go, her heart breaking, tears streaming down her face. She knew that she had lost him, that he was beyond her reach, consumed by the darkness he had sworn to destroy. She had to find some way to stop this, before he ruined himself. She was alone, left with only one choice. She made her decision. She would leave. If she couldn't save him from himself, she would at least save herself. The raven had flown, and she was no longer bound to stay and watch its destructive path. Chapter 17. A Kingdom Divided. Isolde's decision to leave Ravenswood was not made lightly. It was a desperate act, a last resort in a situation that had spiraled out of control. She could no longer stand idly by and watch Aldrich destroy himself and everything they had built together. She had to escape, to find a place of safety, to rebuild her life. She planned her escape carefully, secretly gathering supplies, making arrangements with a trusted servant, a young stable boy named Thomas, the same one who had carried her initial message to Aldrich. He was loyal to her, to Ashenmere, and he understood the danger she was in. She chose a moonless night, when the castle was quiet, when Aldrich was away on one of his expeditions. She dressed in simple clothes, concealing her identity, taking only what she could carry. She left a letter for Aldrich, a farewell message explaining her reasons, expressing her sorrow, and her forgiveness. She met Thomas in the stables, where he had prepared a horse for her, a swift, sturdy animal that would carry her far away from Ravenswood. She mounted the horse, her heart pounding against her ribs, her mind filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Godspeed, my lady," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "May the saints protect you." Isolde nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She spurred her horse, galloping out of the castle gates, following the same path she had taken on her arrival, but this time, she was fleeing, not seeking. As she rode, she looked back at Ravenswood, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. She felt a pang of sadness, of regret, for what might have been, for the life she had hoped to build there. But she knew that she had made the right decision, the only decision she could make. She rode through the night, her destination a distant monastery, a place of sanctuary where she had a distant relative, a nun who had offered her refuge. It was a long and perilous journey, but she was determined to reach it, to find a measure of peace, to heal. Meanwhile, Aldrich's actions had not gone unnoticed. His relentless pursuit of vengeance had created enemies, powerful enemies who were now seeking to exploit his vulnerability, to bring him down. The king, angered by Aldrich's defiance, had issued a warrant for his arrest, branding him an outlaw, a traitor to the crown. The kingdom was divided, some supporting Aldrich, seeing him as a hero who had avenged a terrible wrong, others condemning him, fearing his ruthlessness, his disregard for the law. The lines between justice and vengeance had blurred, and the realm was teetering on the brink of another conflict. Aldrich, isolated and hunted, found himself fighting a losing battle. His allies dwindled, his resources depleted, his enemies closing in. He was a lone wolf, a wounded animal, driven by his grief and his rage, but his strength was failing, his resolve weakening. He had divided a kingdom, and now it sought to divide itself from him. The letter she had left, still unopened, felt as heavy as the crown's decree in his chambers. He would soon learn that he was truly, utterly alone. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. Isolde reached the monastery, exhausted and emotionally drained, but safe. The nuns welcomed her with open arms, offering her shelter, food, and solace. She found comfort in the quiet routine of the monastery, in the simple acts of prayer and contemplation, in the company of the women who had dedicated their lives to God. She spent her days working in the gardens, tending to the herbs and vegetables, finding a measure of peace in the connection with the earth. She spent her evenings in the chapel, praying for Aldrich, for the kingdom, and for herself. She was trying to heal, to forgive, to find a way to move on with her life. But the past haunted her. She could not forget Aldrich, the man he had been, the man he had become. She could not forget the love they had shared, the brief moments of happiness they had found in the midst of darkness. She could not forget the pain, the betrayal, the loss. One evening, as she was praying in the chapel, she heard a familiar voice. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, was Aldrich. He looked different. He was thinner, his face gaunt and haggard, his clothes worn and travel-stained. He looked broken. "Isolde," he said, his voice hoarse. She rose, her legs shaky, her mind reeling. "Aldrich," she said, her voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here?" He walked towards her, his steps slow and hesitant. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze searching hers. I came to find you," he said. I needed to see you." He paused, then added, "I read your letter." Isolde's heart pounded against her ribs. She had not expected him to find her, to seek her out. She had thought he was lost to her forever. I had to leave, Aldrich," she said, her voice trembling. I could not watch you destroy yourself." He nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said, "and I do not blame you." He looked around the chapel, his gaze lingering on the altar, on the stained glass windows. This is a peaceful place," he said. "It is," Isolde agreed. "It is a place of healing." He looked back at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. "I have done terrible things, Isolde," he said. "Things I can never undo." "I know," she said softly. "I have become the monster I swore to destroy," he said, his voice breaking. He paused, then added, "I have lost everything. My honor, my reputation, my purpose." Isolde felt a pang of sympathy for him, a flicker of the love she had once felt. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers tracing the scars, the reminders of his past. "It is not too late, Aldrich," she said. "It is not too late to change, to find redemption." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers, a glimmer of hope flickering in their depths. The heart, she knew, was finally reckoning with the truth, with the consequences of his choices. It remained to be seen if it could survive. Chapter 19. Ashes to Ashes. Aldrich stayed at the monastery, not as a guest, but as a penitent. He shed his armor, his sword, and his title, becoming simply Aldrich. He worked alongside the nuns, tending to the gardens, performing menial tasks, seeking solace in the simple routines of monastic life. He was trying to atone for his sins, to find a measure of peace, to rebuild his shattered soul. Isolde watched him, her heart aching for the pain he was enduring, the transformation he was undergoing. She saw the remorse in his eyes, the humility in his demeanor, the yearning for redemption. She saw the man he once was, the man he could still be. They spent time together, talking, sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their regrets. They spoke of the past, of the mistakes they had made, of the love they had lost. They spoke of the future, of the possibility of healing, of forgiveness, of a new beginning. One evening, as they were walking in the gardens, Aldrich stopped and looked at Isolde, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I understand if you cannot forgive me, Isolde," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I have caused you so much pain." Isolde looked at him, her heart overflowing with compassion. "I have forgiven you, Aldrich," she said. "I forgave you a long time ago." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines of her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You are a remarkable woman, Isolde," he said. "You have a strength, a kindness, a grace that I do not deserve." "We all make mistakes, Aldrich," she said. "The important thing is to learn from them, to grow." He nodded, his gaze searching hers. "I am trying," he said. "I am trying to become a better man." He paused, then added, "I know I can never replace what I have lost. But I hope, in time, we can find a measure of peace together. Here, away from the darkness." Isolde felt a warmth spread through her, a flicker of hope in the ashes of their past. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine desire for redemption. She saw the possibility of a future, a different future, a future built on forgiveness, on healing, on love. "I would like that, Aldrich," she said, her voice soft. "I would like that very much." He smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile she had not seen in a long time. It was a small step, a fragile beginning, but it was a start. But as they held that moment, they suddenly heard shouts and the sound of horses coming towards the monastery. Aldrich's peaceful demeanor shifted. They had been found. Chapter 20. The Dawn of Redemption. The shouts grew louder, the sounds of approaching horses echoing through the quiet grounds of the monastery. Aldrich's hand instinctively went to his side, where his sword used to be, but he was unarmed, a penitent, not a warrior. He looked at Isolde, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "They have found us," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Who?" Isolde asked, her heart pounding against her ribs. "The king's men? Perhaps," Aldrich said. "Or Reginald's allies, seeking revenge." The nuns, alerted by the commotion, rushed out of the chapel, their faces filled with alarm. The Mother Superior, a wise and courageous woman, approached Aldrich and Isolde. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "We are in danger," Aldrich said. "We must prepare to defend ourselves." The Mother Superior nodded, her expression resolute. "This is a sanctuary," she said. "We will not allow it to be violated." She turned to the nuns, issuing orders in a calm, authoritative voice. The nuns, though unarmed, were not defenseless. They knew the hidden passages, the secret rooms, the places where they could hide, where they could resist. Aldrich, despite his lack of weapons, took charge, his instincts as a warrior resurfacing. He organized the defense, directing the nuns, securing the entrances, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The attackers, a band of heavily armed men, stormed the monastery gates, their faces contorted in anger and hatred. They were led by a man Isolde recognized, one of Reginald's lieutenants, a man known for his cruelty and his ruthlessness. "Aldrich Blackwell," the man shouted. "Come out and face your judgment." Aldrich stepped forward, his head held high, his expression defiant. "I am here," he said, his voice ringing out across the courtyard. "What is it you want?" "Vengeance," the man shouted. "Vengeance for Lord Reginald. Vengeance for our fallen brothers." "Reginald was a traitor," Aldrich said. "He deserved to die." "You will pay for your crimes, Blackwell," the man shouted. "You will die by the sword." The attackers charged, their swords drawn, their intentions clear. Aldrich stood his ground, unarmed but unyielding, ready to face his fate. But then, something unexpected happened. The nuns, armed with whatever they could find, farming tools, kitchen utensils, stones, rushed forward, forming a human shield around Aldrich and Isolde. They fought with a ferocity that surprised the attackers, their courage fueled by their faith, by their determination to protect their sanctuary. Isolde, inspired by their bravery, joined the fight, using her wits, her knowledge of the monastery, to outmaneuver the attackers, to lead them into traps, to disarm them. The battle was fierce and chaotic, but the nuns and Isolde, aided by Aldrich's strategic guidance, managed to hold their ground. The attackers, surprised by the unexpected resistance, began to falter, their numbers dwindling. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a horn sounded, a clear, resonant call that echoed across the battlefield. It was the king's men, arriving at last, alerted by the commotion, by the reports of Aldrich's presence at the monastery. The attackers, realizing they were outnumbered and outmatched, surrendered, their dreams of vengeance shattered. The king's men took them into custody, securing the monastery, restoring order. As the sun started to rise, Aldrich stood amongst the nuns, exhausted and wounded. Aldrich looked to Isolde, a true dawn beginning to break. The fight was over, and a true redemption, earned not through bloodshed, but through sacrifice and courage, had finally begun. Epilogue. The years that followed were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of reconciliation. Aldrich, pardoned by the king for his past actions, in light of his service in uncovering Reginald's plot and his subsequent defense of the monastery, returned to Ravenswood, not as a lord, but as a steward, overseeing the lands on behalf of the crown. He dedicated himself to restoring the castle, to rebuilding the community, to earning the trust and respect of the people. Isolde remained by his side, her strength and her wisdom a constant source of support. She helped him to navigate the complexities of his new role, to make amends for his past mistakes, to build a future based on justice and compassion. She became a beloved figure in the community, known for her kindness, her generosity, and her unwavering spirit. They never forgot the darkness they had endured, the pain they had suffered, the losses they had sustained. But they did not allow the past to define them. They learned from their mistakes, they grew stronger, and they found a measure of peace, of happiness, in their shared commitment to a better future. Ravenswood, once a symbol of fear and oppression, became a haven of hope and healing. The castle, rebuilt and restored, stood as a testament to their resilience, their courage, and their love. The echoes of the past still lingered, but they were fainter now, replaced by the sounds of laughter, of children playing, of a community thriving. Aldrich and Isolde never had children of their own, but they embraced the children of the community as their own, nurturing them, guiding them, teaching them the values of honor, loyalty, and compassion. They created a legacy, not of bloodshed and vengeance, but of love and redemption. One evening, many years later, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the lands they had rebuilt, Aldrich looked at Isolde, his gray eyes filled with a deep and abiding love. "Thank you, Isolde," he said, his voice soft. "For saving me. For loving me." Isolde smiled, her heart overflowing with emotion. "We saved each other, Aldrich," she said. "We found our way back to the light together." The sun set over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the land, a promise of a new day, a new beginning. The shadows of the past had finally receded, replaced by the dawn of a future filled with hope, with peace, with love. And the falcon, once a symbol of a fallen house, soared once more. The end.